Good evening, dear friends. Welcome to the latest webcast, jointly hosted by Gateway House and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, or CAS, our regular institutional partner. We welcome you all, our distinguished panelists, and especially Peter Rimmel, resident representative of CAS to India, and his team. We have consciously chosen a very important and timely topic for discussions today: sanctions and counter-sanctions. I promise you a very fascinating dialogue on a subject that covers not only international law, but perhaps ethics, economy, technology, defense, diplomacy, and real politics. Sanctions are defined as restrictive measures that perhaps fall in the space between diplomacy and military action. By nature, they are coercive. Sanctions by a multilateral organization are different from sanctions when they are imposed by an individual state or a group of states or organizations. And then we know that perspectives on sanctions differ. They would be different in the case of those who impose sanctions and in the case of those who are the targets of those sanctions. Scholars classify sanctions among at least three categories: comprehensive, sectoral, and smart or targeted sanctions. Do they work? Are they justified? What happens when they affect friends and partners, even as they are aiming to hurt adversaries? These and many other questions of this kind will be answered by our very distinguished group of panelists. And let me very quickly introduce them to you. We have Dr. Erika More, Senior Researcher, Global Governance Center and Coordinator, Geneva International Sanctions Network, with us. We have also Ivan Timofeyev, Director of Programs at the Russian International Affairs Council, a regular institutional partner for Gateway House. And I'm very happy to welcome my friend, Ambassador Manjeet Singh Puri, who is a former ambassador of India to Nepal, European Union, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and former ambassador DPR to the UN. He's a respected expert on multilateral affairs, and we all look forward to reading his columns that appear frequently. I'm particularly happy that the panel will be moderated by my colleague, Samir Patil. And I'm looking forward to the day when I can add Dr. Samir Patil to his name. He is our Fellow for International Studies program at Gateway House. He will handle the whole discussion. And at the end, it will be also our pleasure to welcome Amit Bhandari, also my colleague at Gateway House, who will deliver the closing remarks at the end. As you know, we have at Gateway House a very clear-cut template for this kind of dialogue, which is based on our recognition of the value of the time of all of you. So without wasting an extra second here, let me invite Peter Rimmel to deliver his remarks at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajiv. Esteemed panelists, dear Manjit, dear Rajiv also, friends, ladies and gentlemen, since the second half of the 20th century, most of the punitive actions against nations accused of flouting internationally recognized laws took a fundamental shift from the military options to the economic dimensions. This fact in itself, and I hope you will agree with me on this point, is a reflection of a highly encouraging change in focus towards increased protection of and concern over human lives, respect for human rights, and ultimately universal peace. However, even today, sadly, and there is no hoodwinking ourselves, our world is riddled with interstate disputes that often cannot be resolved solely through diplomatic channels. As a result, we have seen the emergence of this century's favorite non-lethal instrument in the policymakers' toolkit, the imposition of sanctions. The controversial question of whether sanctions are useful or rather detrimental has gained a great deal of traction and has become the subject of some heated debates. I'm sure that today's webcast, which features expert panelists hailing from diverse backgrounds, will prove an insightful and enlightening addition to this lively discourse. Now, sanctions have attracted an inglorious reputation in recent past, as they are inter alia frequently associated with a unilateral and comprehensive US embargo against Cuba over the last 6 decades. In the process of these sanctions, the USA sealed off Cuba from the rest of the world in order to persuade Cuba to depart from its communist-led political leadership. Although, I have to mention that not before President Kennedy ordered his secretary to buy 1,200 Cuban cigars before. Tongue planted firmly in cheek, I can say the imposer too needs to plan the sanctions, as it can be a double-edged sword. Not surprisingly, initially this carrot and stick approach to negotiations may have put the Cuban government under pressure, but over the years the stick became moldy and did not really sting too much, with the carrot not looking too appetizing either. Fidel Castro stayed in power and Cubans adapted, became more and more self-reliant, and tried to make the best of the situation, with the hundreds of thousands of old-timers lining the Cuban streets today being emblematic of this. So we can see this as a sample and can ask the question, did sanctions work at the end? Did they not? The fact that such comprehensive sanctions lack positive outcomes, as well as have adverse consequences on the most vulnerable segments of the target countries' populations, has become common knowledge among policymakers worldwide. Since 2004, all UN Security Council sanctions have targeted specific individuals or companies associated with or operating in a targeted country. Recent targeted sanctions, such as the coordinated action by the EU, the United Kingdom, United States, and Canada against China's human rights abuses in Xinjiang, are also representative of this paradigm shift. These targeted sanctions are designed to be narrow in scope to effectively limit their humanitarian impact. With regard to situations where serious human rights violations occur, such as is the case with the detention centers designed for the Uyghur minority in China, targeted sanctions are certainly the least the EU can do to show that it will not refrain from upholding its core values of the rule of law, human dignity, and human rights. When designed, implemented, and enforced multilaterally, thoughtfully, and transparently, targeted sanctions can be incredibly effective, as was also the case with Libya in 2003, with sanctions leading the country to dismantle its weapon of mass destruction program. They are one of the last remaining tools of democratic nations to end violent conflicts, to prevent grand corruption, and to curb massive human rights violations within nations led by authoritarian regimes. China's response of counter-sanctions, including the sanctions of entire EU parliamentary committees, on the other hand, clearly revealed the CCP's lack of understanding of the rule of law and human rights. Moreover, this reaction alludes to the danger of abusing this instrument of conflict resolution as a means of blackmailing other countries into bowing to the will of an authoritarian regime. This abuse of sanctions presents us with a dilemma that will continue to haunt us in our increasingly polarized world and which merits due debate and reflection on occasions such as the present one. Let me conclude. In the end, the choice is up to our policymakers. Targeted sanctions against individuals or members of government who proceed with serious human rights violations, or not to intervene and suffer the consequences of being perceived as silent supporters of the abuses. For me, the choice is rather an easy one. To put it in the words of the writer Elie Wiesel, there may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest. Targeted sanctions will certainly not stop all human rights violations by authoritarian regimes, but neither will mere inaction. As the axiom goes, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And now, to avoid any sanctions, I better stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bhatia and Peter. So before I open the discussion, let's first explain the house rules. So the discussion will run about for 45 minutes, and after that, we will have the Q&A with the audience for 15 minutes. Please put your questions in the box, and please also do mention for which of the panelists the question is addressed to. So without any delay, let me start the discussion. My first question is Dr. Erika Morey. How does the European Union and the West in general conceptualize sanctions as a foreign policy tool?
Thank you, Samir, and thank you, Ambassador, as well, and Peter also for these very interesting opening comments. And thanks again for this very kind introduction, for having me as well. I would much prefer to be with you in Mumbai, of course, but these are the times we're living in. So regarding the EU and its allies' conceptualization of sanctions, well, I would say this is twofold, really, at the current time. The first is that there remains a general preference to apply sanctions through the multilateral fora, that's to say through UN resolutions. And as you'll know, in the past, sanctions have been agreed on areas such as human rights, counterterrorism, nuclear non-proliferation, good governance, democracy, various aspects in relation to ending of conflicts and hostilities, peace building, and so on. What we see, though, in the last few years is that the number of new targeted UN sanctions regimes appears to have slowed down or stabilized. So it reached a high of 16 different regimes in 2015, and then it went down to 15 in 2018, 19, and 2020. And this currently includes some 800 individuals and 300 entities. What we see in parallel is that the impasse that has been encountered at the UN Security Council among the permanent 5 members on agreeing a common way forward on a whole host of different major security and humanitarian conflicts and crises around the world is that we've seen a very steep rise, as you've already said, of autonomous or unilateral sanctions. Now, this has been at times supplementing UN measures, such as the cases of Iran and North Korea, but it also has been adopted in complete absence of any action at the UN, or in the UN framework. So if we think of cases like Syria, Venezuela, or in response to chemical weapons attacks, cyber attacks, and so on, what we see is the increasing use of autonomous sanctions to address these kinds of issues. The US is, of course, the most prolific user of sanctions around the world. It's quite hard to document exactly how many they have in place because of the complexity of US Treasury sanctions in particular. But one recent study estimated that around 150 sanctions regimes were employed in the period between 1990 and 2015. And that's in comparison to around 75 by the EU and 35 by the UN. So what we see here, of course, is that the US is really the dominant player on this scene, with the EU following suit and kind of following the leadership of the US. And then we have a whole load of other Western allies that tend to align with these practices: Canada, Japan, Switzerland, Australia, now the UK, of course, following its departure from the EU as well. So what we see is a whole load of new topics being tackled by these autonomous measures. I've already mentioned chemical weapons and cyber, also more specialized human rights sanctions. And then the US has also developed its own sanctions and related regulations to tackle a whole load of other things like corruption, drug trafficking, the illicit use of cryptocurrencies, the behavior of telecommunications firms, and so on. They're also thinking about their use for new areas such as public health, misinformation, COVID-19 accountability. The EU, for its part, has also used sanctions for very new purposes outside of the UN framework. This has included the case of the Russia-Ukraine sanctions regarding respect for territorial integrity, measures protecting against the effects of the extraterritorial application of US legislation, and that's rather similar to the new legislation employed by China to protect from US secondary sanctions. And then other areas such as drilling activities in the Eastern Mediterranean in relation to Turkey. So what I would say is it's a rapidly changing sphere. The EU is typically working in very close conjunction with its allies, particularly the US, Canada, and the UK, but also others. And there's a lot of change happening at the moment, not only with regard to objectives, purposes, and the breadth and scope, but also in terms of how to respond to the changes that are going on elsewhere in the world, particularly in China and Russia.
Right. Thank you, Erika. That's a very interesting terminology that you use, autonomous sanctions, because we tend to use the terminology of unilateral sanctions. So I'm now going to come to Dr. Ivan Timofeyev. Ivan, as a receiver of some of these Western sanctions, how does Russia view this shift from the United Nations-led multilateral sanctions to these unilateral sanctions or autonomous sanctions primarily imposed by the West?
Well, thank you very much, Chair, for your question. And indeed, in the Russian case, there is a kind of shift in their attitude towards sanctions. For quite a long time, Russia has been very critical about unilateral or autonomous sanctions, and their official position was that only those sanctions which are fixed in the UN Security Council resolutions are legitimate in terms of international law. And well, this is a great, huge debate in the international law itself. So what sanctions can be considered legal or illegal, right? However, in previous 7 years, in the framework of increasing sanctions pressure against Russia, Russia itself conducted quite a huge work to modernize its counter-sanctions legislation. For instance, prior to 2014, when extensive sanctions emerged, we had a special law which was called, and which is still called, the Law on Special Economic Measures, and it was about the implementation in Russia of the decisions of the United Nations, right? So special economic measures had been viewed as a way to implement UN decisions. However, after 2014, when the need for counter-sanctions became much more acute, there have been, since then, there have been a number of legal changes. The law, which I mentioned on special economic measures, was changed, and now we distinguish the measures to enforce UN resolutions and the measures in response to the unilateral sanctions. So, in a sense, the Russian position shifted towards more tolerant attitude towards unilateral sanctions. What we use in response to foreign sanctions is, in fact, unilateral sanctions too. However, what is fixed in the legislation is that we use them only as a kind of retortion, as a kind of response. So we don't use it first, right? But we are mirroring this in response to the hostile actions or in response to violation of the rights of Russian citizens, as it is fixed in the legislation. In 2018, we got another portion of legislation which is enlarging this, and the enforcement practice and the practice of implementation of this legislation is rising. I would say that one of the significant things we had in the recent past is a new law which allows Russian companies which are facing sanctions to move the arbitrage processes from abroad to Russia, right? So, and it was quite negatively taken by the partners of Russian businesses abroad, and there are already a number of cases in the Russian arbitrage which were in favor of sanctioned companies, right? So, in sum, what we can witness is that yes, Russian position is getting more tolerant toward unilateral sanctions because we are using them ourselves, right? But at the same time, the peculiarity is that we are using them in response, and this is something close to the Chinese interpretation. So if you look at this brand new Chinese law on sanctions, which they adopted on June 10, they have nearly the same interpretation that, guys, we are using sanctions in response. And last but not least, informal sanctions. So this has been quite an extensive Chinese practice, and in a sense, that was part of the Russian foreign policy toolbox because, well, at some points, Russian government used informal sanctions in terms of sanitary legislation, or some regulations of the markets. And this has never been called sanctions, but in fact, that was a kind of restrictions, right? And same practice was had been in the Chinese case. But now, what we can witness is that Russian sanctions toolbox is becoming more and more formalized in legislation, and same trend is relevant for China.
Great. Thank you so much, Ivan, for that perspective on sanctions from Russia. So I'm now going to come to Ambassador Manjeet Singh Puri. Ambassador, from your own experience in New York and Brussels, how do you assess the efficacy of the United Nations sanctions as well as these Western sanctions?
Samir, thank you very much. I am particularly delighted to see you after many years when we met in Brussels, when you were there with the Honourable Member of Parliament. I also want to thank Gateway House, Ambassador Bhatia, Manjeet. Thank you very, very much for thinking of me. And Ambassador Bhatia, great to see you, sir. Looking wonderful. Peter, you and I have met once or twice over these webinars, but I'm an old German hand. I've served in both Bonn and Berlin. I have 2 children born in your country, which is perhaps more than what you can say for yourselves. And I have been the only non-German to have had a pass to eat in the German canteen in the permanent representation of Germany to the United Nations. So I'm very delighted to be here with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Dankeschön für die Einladung. Look, I want to say something to you, and let me make it a little interesting and a bit different from my 2 colleagues. And I'm speaking like a practitioner. First of all, Peter, I want to thank your country for having voted with me, with India, on the famous Libya resolution, i.e. abstained. I know the poor foreign minister lost his job later on, etc., etc. And maybe your party didn't agree with it, but they did the right thing. Because as you said, if you could get them to dismantle their, yes, can you hear me? If you could get them to dismantle their weapons of mass destruction, there was no reason to get rid of Gaddafi in the way it was done. There are so many other reasons behind this. And I am, in a sense, for sanctions because they are better than war. And I have seen 2 cases in front of my eyes, in front of all of us, both Libya and Syria. Countries which may have had lots of faults, but was certainly nowhere near the most terrible and most egregious. And we have ruined these 2 societies. as a result of war. So, I'm saying this openly to try and make this much more competitive. Look, what are sanctions? They are yet another element of the toolbox or the toolkit, a word which we use very often now in India. They are games that people play. There is nothing else to it. Not many people are willing to go to war. With Libya, it's all right. You come by planes, nobody lands on the ground. But who else is willing to go to war anywhere? Because you don't want to lose any of your people, especially those who arrogate to themselves the moral right of knowing everything that is right and everything is wrong with the other people. Now, I'm not standing up for the moral wrong. I'm standing up for the moral right because I firmly anchor myself in liberal traditions and I anchor myself in democracy. And I'm happy that when President Biden met President Putin, one of the things which they said they will work on is the JPOA. Wasn't the JPOA perhaps a smart way of going forward? And please think about this. Ivan, I think I read your piece. If I'm not mistaken, the UN sanctions were a necessary element. And that is why no matter what Mr. Trump tried to do, the sort of reverse reaction that was built into the original Security Council resolution, that if anybody kind of backs out, the sanctions will jump in, was particularly important. But I'll just leave two thoughts with all of you here. The Iran sanctions, and essentially why did they work to the extent that they worked? Because the weapon used was the US dollar, which is the most important weapon for all of us. Perhaps not for Russia, I can't answer that question, but for China, it certainly is an important thing. It certainly was very important for India. No matter all the timelines, we found it very difficult to make payments, even for oil purchases. You just couldn't export enough amounts of basmati rice to be able to make up for petroleum exports. And we have suffered as a result. The Chinese have developed completely different autonomous systems which don't interact with the American market. The Russians also possibly, they have a land border. It makes things much easier. But let us remember that the instrument that you use becomes an important instrument. And that UN sanctions, yes, there was a degree of importance. In the old days, there were only 2 UN sanctions. Zimbabwe, Southern Rhodesia then, and South Africa. Did they work? I'm not so sure. I'm really not so sure. When did South Africa finally collapse? When the regime there found that it was better to be part of the world than hang around with just Great Britain, maybe the United States. Things were not working. I'm saying all this to you for a variety of reasons, but now I'm going to say something which will appeal to lots of people. Sanctions have had some positive impact in the case of Pakistan. Look at the sanctions outside what you all are referring to. Look at those which emanated from 9/11, and particularly look at the Financial Action Task Force. I'm classifying it as a sanction. We can classify 1267 as the ultimate sanctions committee, but there also, a country like Pakistan, I think it has taken a bit of a hit in terms of being constrained on what it's able to do financially. And in terms of some of its most egregious players used against India and used in the rest of the world too, they have found themselves constricted and found themselves ring-fenced. In whatever manner, limited manner, nobody is snuffing their life and taking it away. And they find very interesting ways of reinventing themselves, sometimes as hospitals, sometimes as charitable organizations. But things can be done if they are done smartly. If you come to it, certainly unilateral sanctions are about who does it. The United States has this great dollar ability. The European Union, I'm afraid, far less. Against Russia, they're able to do much more for the simple reason that they share kind of contiguous borders. There's a lot happening between the two of them. But then the Russians have found ways and means of getting over with all of that. Look at the good state of the Russian economy and so many other factors. As far as the Chinese are concerned, I think because of the tentacles with which they've spread themselves all over the world, it will be a very difficult set of issues to be able to manage these kind of sanctions. A $14 trillion economy, and remember the United States is only $21 trillion. It's not an easy task to go about doing this. Will they be able to break the hegemony of the dollar? I don't know the answers. but they certainly are trying. And I'm not talking about bitcoins and stuff like that. How will the world move further than this? We'll have to see. Now, before I stop, and I don't want to refer to North Korea, it's perhaps one of the success stories of crimping what a country can do, with North Korean diplomats even being forced to steal and sell goods on the side and so on and so forth. It can't have been a very easy task for them in terms of what they've been up to in the world. But I'll tell you something about sanctions. Why sanctions with a kind of, I know what is best for you. There is the case of South Sudan, and there's the case of Timor-Leste at a smaller level. In the case of South Sudan, now oil prices are not doing very well. But about 10 years back, they were really at the peak. South Sudan is a bit of an oil well. And yet you crimped it for a variety of reasons which you and I can go into in various ways. Frankly speaking, I would have changed the UN special representative. It was much better to have a practical person. South Sudan needs to have an ordinary life. They need to get along with it. We don't need to go about telling them that this is wrong and this is right. They don't even have 5 kilometers of road in the country, a country which is sitting in an oil well. And who are we to go about then saying that Qatar is doing very well or Saudi Arabia is doing very well? No. Moralistic approaches to these things. Well, it's par for the course. We all understand this. We come from a country which also has faced this, has seen it, known it. But I want to make one last point. I think we need to be a little more defined in what we mean by sanctions. We can't take trade measures so very easily to be sanctions, because this way you'll say that, India removed Coca-Cola from here. Was it sanctions against the United States? Not at all. These are kind of trade measures. They get taken under the garb of protectionism. They get taken in various ways possible. You mentioned actions on Galvan. Many of these are not really sanctions, but trade measures. And similarly, these things keep happening. Please note that in the last 8-9 months, our trade with China has been larger than our trade with China ever before. So there are a lot of facets to all of this. This is really one of the elements in the toolbox. But if you compare it to war, I think it's better. Of course, there is nothing like trying to do persuasion and diplomacy, old-fashioned means of doing that. But sometimes, yes, you have to take action. It's best and most important that the action is taken with everyone on board, ideally in the UN Security Council, and not under the responsibility to protect kind of syndromes, which are, again, moralistic for no rhyme or reason, and simply imposing one ideal upon the other. Thank you.
Thank you. In fact, a lot of what you said resonates with us at Gateway House, particularly because we have also tracked the issue of the Financial Action Task Force and its impact on terrorist financing, as well as we have also looked at the feasibility of using sanctions on Pakistan because of its destabilizing actions. Aware of the time, let me just go quickly to Erica. And Erica, Ivan mentioned about the counter-sanctions coming from China and Russia. In your view, what's the efficacy of these counter-sanctions?
Thanks, Samir, and also thank you to the ambassador for those really interesting points. So I would say, first of all, taking a step back and building what Ivan and the ambassador has already said, I would say it's important to think about, when we're thinking about sanctions, it's important to think about the panoply of other measures that are used alongside them, because they're having a cumulative impact. And I think Syria is a really good example here, where we see a really complicated web of not only sanctions imposed unilaterally, but also some UN counterterrorism measures. But we also see things like export controls, counterterrorism, combating the financing of terrorism measures, anti-money laundering, and so on. So we're facing this increasingly complicated environment where the consequences, intended or otherwise, are getting harder and harder to fathom. And I'd also say that it's quite important to think about these sanctions by other names. And I know Ivan has also been doing some thinking about this. So when we're thinking about China, I would say that for quite a long time now, there have been measures or sanctions by other names used. And the ambassador may beg to differ with me, but things like quarantine measures, non-tariff barriers, variation in leadership visits, selective purchases, state-led consumer boycotts and so on. Now, we could debate whether these are sanctions or not, but it's part of the wider economic statecraft that China has, of course, used for quite a long time. They also use their own unilateral sanctions in the case of the DPRK or North Korea that supplemented UN measures. Building on Ivan's point as well, I would also say that prior to Russia's use of counter-sanctions against the EU and US in 2014, there were also regular sanctions by sanctions by other names used as well, such as gas leverage, agricultural import controls, and so on, particularly against former Soviet neighbors, often in response for behavior deemed to be unacceptable, such as closening relations with NATO or the EU. So moving on to what are the likely implications of these new use of sanctions that we've seen much more recently, I would say on the Chinese side, I would say it remains to be seen, because we don't know how often or how aggressively China will be using the various new areas of legislation that it recently implemented. I would say that the travel listings and asset freezes against European individuals and companies and think tanks and so on, unless those individuals and companies are already operating, traveling to, have assets within China, have finances kept in Chinese banks, then these measures are probably going to be largely symbolic at the moment. But we shouldn't say that that's not important, because it represents something of a warning, of course. It will, I would say, definitely complicate commercial interests, and what we've already seen is a number of businesses raising concerns over the implications for them operating in China, if they're also operating elsewhere in the world, in the US and so on, which of course most are. And it also then impacts on things like the trade deal, which is currently under discussion, the comprehensive agreement on investment. And I think the risk as well is that it could impact on joint working elsewhere. We have to think that China, for example, is very much involved in many of the really pressing security negotiations and talks, such as Iran and North Korea. How will this kind of increasingly conflicting environment impact more widely on the broader diplomatic scene? On the Russian side, I think Ivan is probably better placed than me to answer on this, but I think that the counter-sanctions, particularly the countermeasures, were proved quite divisive in Europe, particularly back in 2015 and around that time, led to calls by some EU member states and business lobbies to lift the sanctions, irrespective of any political settlement forged on the Ukraine crisis and on Crimea. But interestingly, unity has remained within the European Union's member states on retaining the sanctions in place and on other areas in regard to Russia. So actually, within the European context, this has represented something of a success, that an internal political cohesion has been retained in spite of the pressures of the counter-sanctions.
Great, thank you, Erika. Ivan, slightly longer question, but I'm sure you will do justice to it by giving a brief response. But basically, I wanted to ask, I have argued in the past that the Western sanctions have had no impact on Russia. So how has the Russian economy adjusted to the sanctions era? And is Russia immune from it, especially now because of its science and technology? And how much of it is actually regard to China, that being done with China?
Well, thank you, Chair. This is a really good question, and there are huge debates among sanctions scholars about the concept of efficiency of sanctions. And if we treat efficiency in terms of change of behavior or target state, I would say that sanctions had few or if any impact on Russian foreign or domestic policy. So they didn't change the Russian principal course on Ukraine or on other issues, right? However, if you look at the issue from the point of view of economy, things are different. And I wouldn't say that there is no damage to economy itself. We should not over-exaggerate it. If you look at the assessments of International Monetary Fund, sanctions affects Russian annual growth in terms of 0.2%. So not so much, but if you take into account that Russian growth itself is not so huge, so well, we shouldn't dismiss these numbers. And what is more important is that sanctions may be more painful in combination with other factors. I remember 2014 when there was a slump on the oil market, and the combination of sanctions and the slump of the oil market caused quite a panic on the markets. And another point is that very often scholars view efficiency of sanctions in the diet of state versus state. But if you look at the diet state versus business, we can find that sanctions may be very effective. And I would refer to the US enforcement actions. And we here at REACT, we conducted quite a huge research on US enforcement to implement their sanctions regimes. And we counted how much businesses, we made research on business behavior under enforcement actions. And 99.9% of companies are meeting the demands of US enforcement agencies. So almost no company under investigation is trying to withdraw from interaction with OFAC or with Department of Justice, etc. So business is very loyal towards the demands of Americans. And in a sense, it's a kind of a paradox when on the level of government between the EU and the United States, there are contradictions on sanctions, but business prefers to follow the demands of Americans, not the promises of Europeans to protect the business. And same, what is more paradoxical, same is about China. Chinese are very negative about US sanctions, but when it comes to relations with Russia, for instance, Russian sanctioned companies, Chinese banks are very loyal to what American demands. And even more paradoxical is that Russian banks are following the demands of American regulations despite their overall negative attitude of our government towards sanctions. This is a paradox of our current time, right? So I would be very careful about this assessment of efficiency. So their sanctions are not efficient in political sense, but they are efficient, quite painful in terms of damage. And I saw the question of Manjit in the chart about the impact on Russian economy. Of course, there is damage, and this damage is accumulating, and the accumulation is the overall trend. And I think Erica mentioned this. I agree with this point. At the same time, well, at some segments, Russians try to benefit from sanctions. And well, Manjit mentioned agriculture. Yes, agriculture benefited from this a bit artificial abundance of Europeans from Russian food market, though customers, I mean, Russian customers suffered because food became more expensive. This money are staying in the Russian economy, but well, myself as a consumer, I'm paying more, right? So in a sense, consumers are subsidizing Russian agriculture. In terms of military industry, sanctions were quite useful because we had to think more actively on how to substitute, for instance, Ukrainian supply chains or to replace.
Ivan, sorry if I. Yeah. Sorry, if I can disrupt you, because I'm going to ask you that question towards the end about impact sanctions on the Russian defense industry exports. But I'm going to come to Ambassador Puri. Ambassador, I mean, what has been the impact of Western sanctions on India, in your view? Just briefly, maybe. You're on mute, Ambassador.
Samir, thank you for your question. And I see in the chat box, that's exactly what Dr. Aditya Bhan asked me. One specific area, space and missile program, etc. Look, the nuclear program, you know, things did take a backseat. But then for a large country like India, what did it do? It did exactly what someone asked Ivan, which is what happened to Russia. And as Manjit put it, well, then self-reliance came to the fore. Then the large country came forward to do a lot more itself. And of course, find some clever ways around matters too. So remember that some of these things are possible and they can be successful in smaller countries whose abilities are limited. But when you look at larger countries, It only means a little bit more time. If you can utilize the time well, fine. But look at what it has done for our space program. And I particularly want to mention the space program. It perhaps has allowed us to develop such things as we may not have done otherwise, to become not just more self-reliant, but to add to the global understanding of how to harness space and in terms of technology. Similarly, in nuclear power, look at the cool reactors that we have developed, which would otherwise never have come about because you'd be able to get them easily. So many things happen which are also positive as a result, but there is a price to pay, and that's something that we all see. Peter, thank you for your little message. I noted that. Thank you very much. May I answer this question that somebody asked me about China?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. This is Elisa Marini Schaefer asking me about China. Look, these sanctions, etc., are not just games that countries play, but they are also part of what they do for domestic consumption. We are looking at China for the Uyghur problem. It's not today's problem. Yet today we are doing it because there is a certain need in our own societies. In what China has done in terms of what we have seen, the whole world has seen in terms of COVID, it has allowed a certain focus to take place. So we need to do it. Now, my point on many of these subjects is that some of the things you have to do, even if you know that their efficacy may be low, it may not have much impact, but you must do it. You have to do it for yourself. You have to go do it for the overall message that it puts across, and it does hint to the other person that, look, everything is not ironclad as far as you're concerned. There is a little Achilles heel. Let's press it. Let's see what happens to you. And the Chinese would also have to learn to deal with these issues. It isn't that everybody goes to them and hugs them and say, hunky dory, what a great market that you are. No, today you also come around and look at the world. It's a rules-based world. It has certain red lines. You also learn to follow it. You can be part of it, but you need to follow some of these things. You can't have it both ways.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. So we have exactly 6 to 7 minutes left for the panel discussion. So before we turn to the audience Q&A, and already some of the have been answered, but let me start with like maybe a 3-minute answer to questions. So I'm going to come to Ivan and ask him to continue his argument about the challenges faced by Russian defense industry when it comes to and the impact on sanctions, particularly because also India is probably will be subject to the sanctions when it purchases the S-100 missile system from Russia later this year.
Well, thank you very much, Samir. This is indeed quite an important question. And there is a risk of sanctions, secondary sanctions fixed in the public law 115/44, CAATSA, Countering American Adversaries through Sanctions Act, which states that US may impose sanctions against the buyers of significant volumes of Russian arms. Arms techniques, and the legislation has been already implemented against China and well, partly against Turkey. There were exemptions for Vietnam, Indonesia, and India, but still, well, this is as far as I remember, these exemptions have been revoked already. So there is a risk. However, I wouldn't overestimate this risk. I remember Amit had very insightful proposals on how Russia and India could overcome these risks, and well, Amit presented this point of view both in India in our joint meetings and in Russia. There are mechanisms to make deals in the national currencies. So, and even if there are secondary sanctions of US against some Indian entities, Chinese experience shows that this is not critical. I remember that in Chinese case, one Department of Ministry of Defense and one official was blocked, and well, this is nothing in terms of economy. So this is painless. And in terms of India, getting back to India, I wouldn't expect that Americans would impose even these sanctions against New Delhi, because, well, Washington strives to have India as closer partner in Asia Pacific and Indo Pacific. So I anticipate that at least Biden's administration would avoid such steps in forcing Indian side to follow CAATSA legislation. And what is most important is that there is strong political will on the Indian side to satisfy its security interests despite sanctions risks. And Indian Foreign Minister and Indian Prime Minister have voiced this several times. So in terms of Russia-India relations, this is not a major risk, I would say.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sir Ivan. Ambassador Puri, you spoke about in the initial remarks about actions taken by India against Pakistan and China after the Pulwama attack and the Galwan clash, which happened last year. India will consider ever becoming a sanctioning nation, basically impose full-fledged sanctions on Pakistan for their destabilizing actions?
Samir, thank you very much. Let me just take one question which is in the chat box. Ambika Khanna about Chahabar Port. Ambika, you heard what Ivan said, and you also perhaps heard what I said earlier. The power of the dollar is all-consuming. As he mentioned, Ivan mentioned, Russian banks are not willing to do things that the Russian government wants it to do. Why do you think Indian private sector would want to go into Chahabar Port? What are they going to get if they won't get any business across the world, which is all dollar denominated? So I think the reality of some of these things is very important to understand, and to understand that who is levying the sanction, what is the instrument being used for the levying of the sanction, and who is the target. And when you look at all these, I think when we look at Iran, it is a particularly interesting, large point of action as compared to smaller places that we talk about. With Iran, the Chinese perhaps built a parallel pipeline, a parallel economy, oil for actually feeding Iran. Iran is a nearly $500 billion. And when that happens, you could perhaps do it. The Russians could have also done it up to a point, perhaps not able to satisfy consumeristic demands in Iran. We need to understand that. My colleague, Ambassador Suresh Goyal, has mentioned something about large countries and so on. I completely agree with him. That's exactly the way it is. Samir, coming to your question about Pakistan. Look, we have to take action against Pakistan. When Pakistan indulges in acts which are terrorist acts and which are targeted to India, the question of not taking action against them, both on multilateral forum as well as bilaterally, just does not arise. So that in the FATF, we support those who try and bring Pakistan to heel, if I may say so, that Pakistan has to mount great global efforts to keep itself at least in the gray list and not get put in the black list. So there are many issues, and certainly we will continue to do that. In terms of our own bilateral, look, our trades are limited in terms of direct interactions, but at times we have imported large amounts of sugar, we've imported large amounts of cement, and yes, they do become victims of those particular things. In terms of travel of individuals, those people are invariably designated terrorists in India. The question of their coming here does not arise. So all countries in the world would try to do it, and they try to do it to the best of their ability. Abilities of everyone, of course, varies, which is why when we notice who is most successful in terms of their sanctions and their abilities on sanctions, the ones with the largest economy and the one with the greatest play is the most effective. Is it sufficiently effective? That's a different matter. They also deal in it in a much better manner. And again, I would ask everyone to read Ivan's paper, which deals with you how the United States has perhaps perfected the way of you going about acting on sanctions. It's not just one man's idea and the foreign ministry does it or someone. How systemically you work on that and you leverage the great power that you have, which is weaponization of the dollar.
Right. Thank you so much, Ambassador. In fact, Ambassador mentioned Ivan's paper. So Ivan's paper is actually titled Post-COVID-19 Sanctions Policies in for Epidemics of Sanctions. That's a very interesting title, Ivan. So thank you for sharing that paper with us. I'm going to share the link in the chat box. My final question to you is, Erika, now given the current polarization in the international system, what are the prospects of the United Nations-led multilateral sanctions to address the shared threats to international security?
Thanks, Samir. Well, I would say that particularly since the pandemic, it's becoming incredibly clear that cooperation across borders remains absolutely essential, particularly through the multilateral framework. And this isn't just in the area of public health and in relation to the pandemic, but it's also, of course, in relation to security, foreign policy, defense, trade, and so on. Nevertheless, what we've seen, of course, in the last 10 or more years is a growing crisis in confidence of global governance processes and institutions. And we have some very prominent examples of that, of course, with things like Brexit and Trump's stance on NATO in the past, and so on. Nevertheless, what I would say is that sanctions, there's clearly a very important ongoing debate regarding the legality of unilateral or autonomous sanctions, regarding their ethics and so on, and how best they should be used. But what we're also seeing is that they're increasing in volume and in use across the world as well, not only in China and in the case of Russia, but you may be interested to hear that actually across other continents, Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and also in Asia, there are a growing number of countries that are either now using autonomous sanctions, unilateral sanctions themselves, or developing frameworks in order to use them. So this is clearly a new landscape that we're looking at. And this requires, as we say, very, very serious thinking about how best to legislate this new environment legally, ethically, diplomatically, and so on. They remain a really important tool. They're often the kind of last resort option left on the table between, we might say, war and words. But often within the UN context, of course, they're often addressing either the behaviour of a P5 member or that of very close allies. So I think while every effort needs to be made to bring back sanctions use as much as possible within the UN framework, I think I personally think there are a lot of challenges that remain to be resolved at the moment. And just to finish on this, I would say that what we need to do then, given the fact that they're clearly here to stay, whether we love them or hate them, we need to incorporate a more refined understanding of, firstly, how to improve the effectiveness while lessening humanitarian consequences. Now, of course, not all sanctions have humanitarian consequences. Those of a very targeted nature, asset freezes, travel bans, arms embargoes, and so on, are unlikely to have much in the way of a humanitarian impact. But what we're seeing nowadays is, with the increased complexity of different measures, the increasing use of broader sectoral sanctions as well, we're starting to see knock-on effects. And this is bringing us back to the debates that we used to see in the 1990s with regard to Iraq, Haiti, Yugoslavia, Cuba, and so on. So I would say that's where I'd like to end. I would say that what really needs to happen here is a step back from where we are with global sanctions practice, and there needs to be some form of global dialogue and improvement of processes within the UN as well. And that's where countries like India, I think, can play a really important role as well in advocating reforms on that front.
Great, thank you so much. So actually, many of the questions have been answered by each of you in your remarks. But one question that was that has remained is, are sanctions just the first pressure tactic before coming to dialogue? And I can one there, and I can come to Ambassador Puri and then Erika. Ivan?
Well, of course, sanctions is a part of the diplomatic instruments, and raising stakes before negotiations is one of the sanctions. And one of the fresh examples is Russia-US presidential summit in Geneva. If you remember, Americans have imposed sanctions, major sanctions, at least twice before the meeting, on March 3 and on April 15. So yes, this is one of the ways sanctions may be used, but that's not the only one. I would say sanctions are important in terms of communication with the internal audience, right? Especially in the United States, to explain their opposition and the Congress that, guys, we are doing something. Look, we did this and that to counter Russia or to balance Russian actions, etc. So sanctions have multiple purposes, and raising stakes before negotiations is only one of them, but not the ultimate one.
Right. Thank you, Ivan. Ambassador Puri?
Thank you very much, Samir. Samir, look, there's absolutely no issue on this at all. The fact of the matter is that people would like that there is either dialogue or there is behavioral change, and that sanctions are towards getting you to do that. But as Ivan said very importantly, in democratic countries, it also addresses your own domestic concerns. Will that really necessarily happen? It doesn't matter. You sometimes do it only because you need to do it for your domestic concerns, and that's it. These Uyghur sanctions vis-a-vis China are perhaps the best case in point in this particular context. Before I end, I'll just answer one question, Dr. Aditya Bhan, because he asked me many, many questions. Dr.
Yes.
Bhan, you are absolutely right about this. But if we start using these words like sanctions for everything, then I don't know the answer to it. Now, let's take this one case in point. You ban Bofors from doing business in India because they got into a bribery scandal in this country. Now, if you call it sanctions, well, yes, I'm afraid that's the case. But then, economic transactions have their own fallouts. There are collateral damages, there are unintended consequences, there are many things that happen. You have to take a call, and I believe that's what governments have to do. Have they taken the right call or not? In hindsight, we all have 24/24 eyesight. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Erika?
Thank you. Yeah, I would say that it's really important to have I guess what we need is a more nuanced understanding of how sanctions exert an impact. So in the sanctions scholarship world, what we tend to look at a lot of the time is that they can, for example, coerce a change in behavior, they can constrain a target's access to vital resources, financing, and so on. Or they can also signal, it's what Ivan already said, signal both to a domestic audience that the government in question is actually doing something, or it will signal to the target itself, signal to other would-be detractors from international norms, don't use chemical weapons or this will happen. And also some claim that it's used to influence allied behavior. Very much the US is thought to do that as well in terms of getting others to come alongside on particular issues. So I would say what we need is a more nuanced, or particularly policymakers could do with a more nuanced understanding of the effectiveness of sanctions. They don't operate in a vacuum. They're only as good as the way in which they're combined with other policy tools, trade, diplomacy, defense, and so on, referrals to legal tribunals. Unfortunately, what I see is particularly in the US, in the US government, they don't tend to see sanctions this way. It's often more about imposing economic pain rather than trying to bring about some kind of a change. There's a disconnect between the goals of the sanctions and the kind of economic pain that is inflicted. And I think that is what makes the US sanctions particularly controversial under the Trump administration with its maximum pressure campaign. So I would just finish by saying what we can learn from scholarship on sanctions is that there are some really interesting and sophisticated ways that sanctions could be better engaged with other tools at play, such as mediation, peacekeeping. Some of my colleagues at the Graduate Institute are working on that at the moment. And that's the way we're probably going to come across, get over some of these problems of trying to work out whether or not they're doing what they should be doing.
Great, thank you. So the question from the audience is basically about the cyber attacks, the increasing cyber attacks. And actually that is important in the context of the summit happening between President Biden and Putin. So I'll pose the questions to both Erika as well as Ivan. With cyber operations seeing an increase, how do you see the legal regime around the sanctions developing, especially because there is that problem of attribution, which is the most pervasive problem in the cyberspace? I'll start with Ivan first.
Well, this is a very important question, and indeed, this is an issue for US-Russia relations because Americans have already imposed a number of sanctions on cyber, and they're getting more and more alarming for us because in the recent round of sanctions in April 2021, Americans imposed sectoral sanctions against Russian digital sector. And I talked to their stakeholders from digital sector in Russia, and they're very concerned because they are not involved in the cyber attacks, but they are suffering. So they are facing risks of sanctions against this or that companies. So that's a problem. And again, the issue of attribution is a huge issue, not in terms of sanctions, but also in terms of security in general, because if some cyber incidents occurs, it may cause a chain of escalation which may be undesirable and disastrous. Russians and Americans agreed yesterday to launch a working group on sanctions or on cyber, and I hope that that will be a kind of a stabilizing factor in this realm.
Erika?
Yeah, thank you. I think those are really interesting points from Ivan. I would say that the cyber sanctions domain is a really quite unusual one when we're looking back at the history of how sanctions have been used in the past, because once again, it's about the P5 members most of the time, not always, but that again calls into question international stability and multilateralism and so on. But as you were saying, with the question of attribution, it's a really difficult one because it could be done by, there are various types of cyber attacks, of course, and they could be done by states, but there are also a whole host of other organizations that could be employing them. It could even be a teenager in their bedroom, or it could be a state actor coming from whichever country. And that makes it absolutely essential to get it right. And there are, of course, various impediments to, for example, sharing intelligence of where, that would help on the attribution front, particularly in the European context and with allies. So I think this is a really formidable challenge for those who are thinking about using the measures.
Great. Thank you, all the panelists. In fact, we have still some time left before we go to my colleague for some closing remarks. But each of maybe can give a 30-second closing comment, maybe something which we have not discussed in our discussion. Maybe I'll start with Ambassador Puri, then I'll go to Ivan and then Erika. Ambassador Puri, you're on.
Samir, thank you, and thank you to Gateway House and to CAS for this most interesting get-together. We all come with different perspectives, my colleagues from a scholarly way of thinking, I from a practical sense of approach. But, I firmly believe that this is an element which is there in the toolbox. Now, we have stretched it quite a lot into the area of trade and trade relations and, use this term. But in terms of what the UN Security Council, for example, can do, Chapter 7, it can hardly tell you raise your tariffs. That's not the ways and means of doing it. So if we leave those things out, because, in terms of what countries can do in economic terms, give pain or other things to do, there's a lot, because that's a very, very large toolbox. But in terms of this actual taking action, which hopefully results in some behavioral change or helps you assuage your own domestic constituency, I would like to end by saying a very simple thing. I don't like them, but I would rather have them than military action. I say this on the basis of two countries in the near past in terms of what all of us have seen. Libya, for all that we have everything to say against Mr. Gaddafi, it was a fairly okay country, doing far better than many others. It was going to reach its MDGs. It had wound down its FWMDs program. Look at Syria. It was actually on its way to achieving the MDGs. We may have any number of problems with Mr. Assad, but how many other Mr. Assads are not roaming around in the world? And yet destructions of the countries? No. I would rather have something of this kind in the toolbox and play the game in some sort of a manner and see what happens in terms of behavioral change, etc., because you are the more powerful and so you can levy these things rather than go to the other extreme. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ivan?
Thank you very much, Samir. Ambassador Puri has mentioned several times about the factor of US dollar and the US financial leadership in the world as a huge leverage for the United States to use sanctions in the foreign policy toolbox. That's an essential factor. And again, that's a kind of a paradox. I use this word quite often today. When, for instance, US and the EU have nearly the same volume of economy, but US is much stronger, much more capable in terms of enforcement of sanctions regimes than the European Union and even China, right? We have conducted a research on the impact of US enforcement on business. I would be happy to share this with you, Ambassador, and with you, Eric, and with all the participants, if you are interested specifically in this topic of US dollar and US enforcement on business. Thanks.
Thank you, Ivan. Erika?
Thank you. I would like to build on both of my esteemed panelists' comments and say that something we haven't touched on today is the problem of de-risking around the world. You may have heard of it referred to as over-compliance or the chilling effect. What we're essentially seeing around the world is that with the increased complexity of the sanctions regimes that are in place, with the global reach of the dollar and the way in which financial transactions need to make use of the currency a lot of the time through correspondent banking channels, and also the raft of other regulations that are often in place alongside sanctions. What we're tending to see now is a situation whereby banks in particular, but also companies across the private sector and also non-governmental organizations are withdrawing from heavily sanctioned countries because they fear fines, or they fear for their reputation, or the bureaucracy is simply too great. And so what we're seeing is a number of countries around the world now simply don't have access to the international financial system anymore. This is the case with North Korea, where there are no remaining banking channels left into the country. It's soon to be the case, hopefully not, but could be soon the case with the case of Syria. And there's a whole load of other countries that are facing these problems. And I think this is where it's absolutely vital in terms of the well-being of citizens around the world, access to essential goods, and recovery from conflicts as well, that this particular problem is given some very urgent and very serious thought by the international community.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. So as they say, all is well that ends well. And if I can add, on time. So thank you so much to all our stellar panelists, Mr. Manjeet Singh Puri, Dr. Timofey, and Dr. Erika. You have really enriched this, and we are, so many unique insights on the subject today. Thank you so much. And also to the wonderful who kept asking, the questions which really brought the dimensions of the issue at hand today. So with that, I now hand over the floor to my colleague, Amit Bhandari, who is a fellow for energy and environment studies at Gateway House, to give his closing remarks. Over to you, Amit. Thank you.
Thank you, Samir. So, thank you for the very stellar panel for the discussion they had, and a special mention to Ivan for mentioning my paper. That was a that was a really good one. So I would just like to summarize in brief the arguments that our panelists have really made. And Erika brought up the most important point initially, that while sanctions have traditionally been thought of as a multilateral tool for making policy, what we have seen is the proliferation of unilateral sanctions, mostly by the US, which has been the most prolific user. And in fact, Ivan is somebody who has studied these unilateral American sanctions in a really deep manner. And he brought out the point that sanctions have not really been able to change the behavior of any large or a major country like Russia, for instance. What they have really done is to have caused some economic pain. And and businesses have also often businesses mostly have followed sanctions, the letter of the law, as dictated by the US, rather than fall foul of Americans. And finally, Ambassador Puri brought up this point that sanctions, while they may not work or they may not be as effective as we want them to be, they are clearly preferable to an armed conflict, and especially the kind that we have seen in Libya and Syria. And of course, he also made this important point about the dominance of the US dollar, which allows America to impose these kind of unilateral sanctions. This is a subject of study which we should definitely be looking at. So once again, I would like to thank the three panelists and Dr. Samir Patil, our excellent moderator, and our three panelists, Dr. More, Dr. Timofey, and Ambassador Puri. We are grateful to all of you for such a rich discussion on and your insights on the subject today. Thank you to our friends from CAS and my colleagues at GH, Gateway House, and also to our wonderful audience, which asked such relevant questions. And thank you all, and we hope to see you for our next webinar in July. Till then, be safe. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. you, Erika. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Take care. Stay safe. We'll be in touch. Thank you.